But the problem in our system is that we don't have institutions that facilitate egalitarian, pluralistic democracy. In fact, we have the opposite. We have institutions that make that kind of democracy extraordinarily difficult to realize. And that's been true even after we passed a set of amendments meant to realize them. Now, up here on the screen, why the Founding Fathers still matter, and then we have this like subtitle here, or the audacity of the founders. I'm using that subtitle because audacity has two meanings. The first meaning of audacity is, well, how dare you? And the second meaning of audacity is kind of the audacity of hope, carpe diem, like seizing something and just going for it, like letting it fly and hoping it works out. And this is how I approach these guys. This is how I approach the Constitution broadly. When I'm critiquing the Constitution, this is one audacity. I don't like it. I have a lot of problems with it. But when I'm admiring the audacity it took to write the Constitution, then I have a lot of good things to say about the Founding Fathers. Or in another meme format, the Drake one, which I feel like is now too old, but I'm in my 30s, I don't care anymore. When I'm looking at the work of the Founding Fathers, I'm like, I cannot believe the audacity they had to make this terrible system. But when I'm admiring their willingness to transform the political system, I'm okay with that. I like that. So, with the rest of the time I have with you, I'm going to talk about sort of my critique, first version of audacity, of the American political system, why I think it is an impediment to the kind of democracy that Americans say that they want, a democracy where there is a measure of political equality between citizens, a democracy where people have a fair opportunity to achieve the kind of life that they want. The Founding Fathers created a system that was just laden with veto points, countermajoritarian mechanisms, and explicit barriers to political equality. We know all the explanations for this, more or less. The Founding Fathers they studied the classical democracies and classical republics of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Renaissance Italy. They were attentive to the dangers inherent in them. Oh, that's for the Biden part that I skipped. Okay. That's Athens, Raphael's School of Athens, okay. So they were attentive to classical Greece, and they warned that the problem with classical Greece was that the direct democracy of the Athenians, where there is an assembly and people gathered in the assembly to directly make law, threatened the tyranny of the majority. If you got everyone together like this, there's sort of nothing really to stop them from imposing their unalloyed will upon the populace. And then for the city-states of Renaissance Italy, which was a less known touchstone, but an important touchstone for the framers and especially for James Madison, the concern was that they were too small. They were so small, and because they were so small, they were vulnerable to the passions of faction. In one of these city-states, a single person could convince a lot of people to do something very stupid and threaten the liberty of everyone else. And so the framers designed a system that tried to account for these theoretical concerns as well as more practical problems, and as well as sort of try to meet the other delegates, the other people in this country where they were. There would be separated powers among separate branches that would prevent the concentration of power that had undermined democratic government or Republican government in the past. I should note real quickly, I'm going to use democratic and lowercase Republican kind of interchangeably here, in part because I think there's an aphorism or something that people say, we're a republic, not a democracy. I just think it's very stupid because republic is Latin for the people and democracy is Greek for rule by the people. So it's like the same word. And so I'm just going to treat them like they're the same word. Anyway, just got to make that parenthetical. I always have to say that. And also to head off anyone who might say it. No offense, thank you for coming. But I just need to do that. So separated powers, they would create a large extended republic comprised of all 13 states to kind of head off the problems of factionalism. Madison makes this very explicit in Federalist 10. If you have a small republic vulnerable to faction, and as you enlarge the scope of the republic, it makes it more difficult for factions to form into large blocks that can threaten the integrity of the system. And then federalism, keeping the states, giving the states considerable authority, dividing sovereignty between the states and the federal government, will make it, in addition to making the federal government less powerful, will make it more difficult for majorities to form. That if a majority forms on the national level, it still may not necessarily be able to work its will on the states. And all these things are designed to kind of head off some of the problems they saw. They're also responding to a good deal of fervent and instability in their own time. It's not as well known, but in the 1780s, it's too much to say American society was collapsing, but it wasn't in great shape. There was depression following the American Revolution, a depression that kind of cratered commodities prices and made it very difficult for debtors to pay their debts and for creditors to recoup them. Events like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, these debtor rebellions really scared the pants out of a lot of the elites that would show up in Philadelphia in 1787. And then you had states like Rhode Island, which famously did not send no delegates to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that were passing quite egalitarian legislation at the time as part of a broader democratic experiment, but also to respond to these conditions. In one of his letters, Madison writes very angrily about paper money because he's like, paper money is bad for me, a person who needs to collect my debts. And so this as much as the theoretical stuff was animating the kind of structure that was built in Philadelphia. The Constitution, the Constitution essentially put a lid on much of the democratic and egalitarian experimentation that was happening in between 1781 and 1787. It's why there was so much opposition that we've kind of retconned out of the picture, but that was quite real to the Constitution. There was fierce and furious opposition to adopting the Constitution over the Articles of Confederation from many Americans who felt that it was directly undermining the democratic rights and privileges they had attained in the Revolution. And they weren't wrong. They weren't wrong about this. The Constitution brought that democratic experimentation to an end. And in its first decade, in the first decade of the Constitution's existence, American government had a much more aristocratic flavor than it had in the previous decade. So for me, that's like the audacity to fight this revolution over democratic values, over self-government, and then because the results weren't to your liking, to essentially launch a soft counter-revolution against the values that you explicitly said you upheld. I don't think that's cool. I think that's bad. And what makes it all the worse is that the vaunted Constitution of 1787, ratified the following year in 1788, it didn't last that long. I think this is another thing that we miss in our collective and our nation's kind of worship of the Constitution as some sort of holy writ. The 1787 Constitution lasted until April 12, 1861. And on that morning, in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the thing crumbled for good. It could not withstand either the democratic pressures that emerged in the time afterwards, the emergence of political parties to structure mass democracy, fundamentally transformed the political order in ways that none of the framers ever really anticipated, and then it couldn't handle the sectional divide over slavery. That divide more or less short-circuited the entire system. And then once that began to play itself out, that Constitution collapsed. The Constitution was then reconstructed, of course, but what's interesting about the reconstruction of the Constitution in the wake of the war, as represented by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, is that although they attempted to bring some measure of political equality to the document, recognizing that the Constitution ought to include all the people who live in the country and not just a select caste of them, there was no real attempt to fundamentally alter the countermajoritarian institutions imposed by the Constitution. Part of that was because, listen, in the decade after the Civil War, it was a kind of a one-party game in town. And so Republicans weren't really worried about trying to win elections. And they weren't really worried about trying to change the system in order to sort of make their newfound constituencies, give them more influence. The other thing is that the assumptions, the fears of majority rule, the fears of majority tyranny were still very much part of the mix, and they were compounded by fears that enfranchising a group of formerly enslaved people might result in chaos for the entire system. And so there was no real appetite to make any of these major structural changes to American government. So we reconstructed the Constitution in some regards, but we left it still with these counter-majoritarian structures. The Senate, the Electoral College, the federal system itself, all these things that exist to prevent the ability of majorities to act still exist under the system, still existed under the system after this major constitutional change. The problem is that these two things are in tension, that a set of amendments meant to introduce political equality can't really coexist with institutions that enshrine political inequality and that allow elites on the local level, on the state level, to cultivate political inequality for their own advantage. This is essentially what Jim Crow was. It was using the divided powers of the American system, using the counter-majoritarianism of institutions like the Senate, of rules like the filibuster, of all these things to create basically a moat around an entire region of the country that could not be breached by any kind of democratic action, barring some sort of overwhelming supermajority that just wasn't going to form. Lawmakers attempted in the 1870s, in the 1880s, and finally in 1890 to try to protect the rights of African Americans in the South, but they couldn't. The counter-majoritarian institutions of the United States prevented that from happening. I think there's a broader lesson there, and you see this sort of happen again and again, that it's not the counter-majoritarianism that's really protected Americans' rights. It's whenever the system has been a little more majoritarian, have majorities been able to assemble to either grant rights or secure them from the actions of those on the bottom that would try to restrict them. There's a bit of a larger point I want to make here. Americans tend to think about American democracy and the Constitution as being, the same thing, like two circles overlapping each other with no, it's not a Venn diagram, the same thing. What I think, and what I'm arguing, is that that's wrong completely. That the Constitution and American democracy are actually two separate things. The American democracy is this big, expansive thing that begins before the Constitution and that has struggled to express itself within the bounds set by the Constitution. The Constitution is simply one attempt to express some of the values of American democracy within a government. And I don't think that that Constitution has ever really done a good job of expressing those values. I mentioned the advent of political parties. You can see it right then and there, that the Constitution makes no mention of political parties. There's no anticipation of political parties by the framers. But within 30 years of ratification, we have political parties. And by the middle of the 19th century, you have kind of almost modern mass political parties. And they're necessary for I think, the ability to do democracy. They disseminate information, they structure people's opinions, they help kind of everyone organize themselves to do democracy. But there's no accommodation for them. And we kind of had to force them into the constitutional system such that it existed. And you can see this everywhere, us trying to force our democratic values into the Constitution. Popular election of the president, which we don't really have, but we effectively had for a time, was a thing that emerges in the 1830s and 1840s as successive generations of Americans, successive cohorts of Americans are like, the president is like he's supposed to be the guy elected by all of us. It's really strange to let state legislatures call the shots. And the first time there's anything like a divergence of the popular vote in the Electoral College, which is in the 1824 election, it becomes a huge scandal. You've heard of the corrupt bargain. That's what the corrupt bargain's about. It's about this divergence between people's democratic intuitions and what the system actually produces. And I think right now what we're seeing in American society, in the way our government's structured and the outcomes it's producing, is that divergence between our democratic intuitions and what the system produces growing ever wider and ever wider. And I think the growth of that delta, you might call it, is very bad. I'm sure there's a better word than bad. It's terrible for American society because I think it, as opposed to inculcating values of self-determination, of a sense that you can act on society and it matters what you say, what you do, how you vote, what it does is encourages the opposite. It doesn't matter what you do or what you say or how you vote. The system simply is never going to respond to an organized majority, not in the way that we intuit that it should. So I didn't talk about Biden, but the point I was going to make about Biden is that in his speech, he sort of implies, this was the September speech in Philadelphia, he implies that the enemies of democracy today in the United States are enemies of the Constitution, that they're opposed to the Constitution. And where I disagree is that, if anything, the people most opposed to pluralistic, egalitarian democracy have an intimate knowledge of what the Constitution allows. And they understand on a very deep level that there's nothing in the Constitution that says this has to be a democracy. Nothing at all. And so rather than frame the protection of American democracy as restoring or protecting the Constitution, I think it's better to frame the defense of American democracy as, in some sense, defending it from the Constitution.